All right, my English teacher friends. So, in this writing workshop, I have another poetry unit that I cobbled together featuring the poetry of the hip hop and rap industry. So, to give you a little context in terms of what I'm doing and kind of the method of my madness here, I do something called the Poetic Seventh, where I group seven poems thematically. I write about two separate poems that the students cannot write about. So in this writing workshop, I'm choosing a Tupac poem and a Kanye West poem. Students cannot write about these two because I'll be giving them my models and exemplars demonstrating how to pull the strings of my templates. And if they were to use these two poems, then we just get into mimicry and there's not a lot of authenticity in terms of the work. There's just a lot of copying. So Tupac poem and Kanye poem they cannot use. There are seven other poems in the packet that they can choose from. So if you want, in addition to me sending you these slides, I can send you those poems as well. They're pretty cool. They feature a few from one from Lil Wayne, Nas, and a couple of other prominent artists that many of our students are familiar with. And that's one of the things I do early in the academic year is get into kind of the history of hip hop and rap and look at some old school stuff like the original, the arbiters of it all, like the last poets, and just start poetry analysis by dipping our toes in things that they're familiar with. And I can teach them all the terms and devices through hip hop and rap. And I'm by no means an expert on this topic whatsoever. But if I read it like poetry, I can do my thing. So, what I'll do with this particular writing workshop is walk you through how we can either declare or invert the thesis while incorporating my templates. And then, as always, if you're familiar with my work, you'll know that we'll tackle the body paragraph syllogistically. The other thing that I'm going to feature in this particular writing workshop is my ball of yarn method in terms of establishing the line of reasoning. For the Tupac poem, I'm going to hammer the syllogism perfectly. The line of reasoning is going to be perfectly cogent and in line. For the Tupac poem, I'm going to break the line of reasoning and show you how to reconstruct it and get it reconfigured and realigned with using three balls of yarn. And when we get there, you'll see what I mean by that. So, as always, when I work with teachers, I tell them that they got to Bob Ross their instruction. And I give the following analogy often, and I'll do it again in this video. So, imagine if Bob Ross were to come on screen to begin an episode of The Joy of Painting. And he were to say something, closely akin to this. Hello, happy little people. Today we're going to paint a beautiful New England autumnal landscape with beautiful fall foliage. And in the center of our canvas, we're going to include an old rickety New England wood-covered bridge going over a babbling brook. Now, when I say you gotta Bob Ross your instruction, I, in a sense, mean get to your easel, get to your canvas, and paint with your students. Just like Bob Ross does. He'll show us explicitly how to do all of those things, and we can approximate what he's doing, even if we are totally inept at painting, and closely approximate what he's doing. Our students can do the same if we paint with them. Now, the kicker with Bob Ross is that he used one template. He called it a heuristic called the wet on wet technique. I use one template for my theses and one template for my body paragraphs. And again, if teachers position themselves as the expert writers in the classroom, it really demystifies the writing process for students. So give them plenty of your writing to look at, and you can show them the good, the bad, the ugly. It does not matter. So the first question that we're going to pose is this: how do I write the introductory paragraph focusing on Kanye West's poem, Divorce? So we know that you can either declare or invert the thesis, but here's the kicker. We know that since we're performing literary analysis, we're analyzing a poem, that we don't want to declare the thesis because that sets us up to make very plot-heavy summations. It kind of reads like Cliff Note summary when you declare the thesis and you break the demand of the assignment, and by default write plot analysis instead of literary analysis. So we'll tweak that and pretty much adhere to the inverted thesis. So as I said, we're going to focus on Kanye West's poem Divorce. This poem is hard to find, but it's in the packet that I will send to you if you request it. So here's the kicker. Implicit in every prompt, you have two questions. What is the authorial intent, and how does the author construct meaning? If students answer both of those questions in the space of the introductory paragraph, they should come out of the gates pretty blazing if they accurately ascertain the correct read of the text. If they answer both of those questions, they're good to go. So here's how I break this down. All of my introductions across the expository modes, so literary analysis, rhetorical analysis, argument, persuasion, synthesis, and even most research, the template calls for 4 sentences for the introductory paragraph. We're going to invert, and I'll unpack what I mean by that more in just a second. The first 3 sentences are going to answer the question, what is the authorial intent? Some teachers pose the question, what is the universal truth, or what is the universal theme? However you want to cloak the language is of your own choosing, but I use the question, what is the authorial intent? The 4th sentence is going to be the thesis statement, and we're answering the question, how does the author construct meaning? And the student is going to focus on the most salient terms and or devices in that particular poem. And again, this for AP Lit teachers, this works for FRQ1 and FRQ2. Gen Ed teachers, you can use it for all genres. It doesn't matter. So when we declare, this is what it looks like. You begin with the thesis. So if you imagine if we were to do this, things would immediately get a little plot heavy. So we're going to avoid this. I typically use it for rhetorical analysis and then synthesis, argument, persuasion, and research. It's a 50-50 flip. It's really contingent upon the language of the prompt. So I'm going to bypass this, and we'll talk about context, background, tier 2 sentence constructs, and the 4-sentence rule in looking at this model. So in this case, the inverted thesis, you end with the thesis. So first 3 sentences, what is the authorial intent? Without getting into plot summation, you're not going to quote, you're not going to retell the story of the poem. Just what is the authorial intent? Last sentence is your point, your thesis. Oftentimes in conversation, we ask people, what's your point? So I like this triangulated diagram because the point is the thesis, which is how does the author construct meaning? Focus on the terms and devices. So end with the thesis, context, background. Now let's talk about some of the nuanced things. It is an academic paper, so I do want to see a fair amount of tier 2 level vocabulary, and what I mean by that is your average run-of-the-mill SAT level words. So for those that are familiar with my work, you know that I run an intensive year-long word study academy with all of my students. I don't care if they're AP students or Gen Ed students. We do intensive vocab study. And I got a lot of tricks up my sleeve to teach vocab, some of which are featured in my YouTube channel. But the ones that aren't, the whole gamut is in my Teach It Right 5-week Mastermind that's offered through the National Writing Project. The other thing we focus on is sentence constructs. So this is part of my Nuance Academy. And I borrow a theory that comes from Strunk and White in their seminal text called Write It Right. They make the assertion that there's 12 different ways to construct a single sentence. So you should see my students manipulating their syntax quite nicely in the hopes of achieving voice rhythm and flow. So they'll have nice supple flowing sentences and not, a lot of struggling and emerging writers overuse the independent clause or the short simple declarative sentence, so it sounds choppy, choppy, choppy. choppy, choppy, choppy in terms of the cadence of their flow. So hopefully my students are a little more flowy than that. And as I've already alluded to, it's going to be exactly 4 sentences. So let's take a look at a few examples featuring Divorce by Kanye West. So the first 3 sentences are going to focus on the universal truth, the universal theme, the intent. Why did Kanye write this? Last sentence, 4th sentence, is going to be the terms and devices that construct the meaning of the poem. It can be said that love does not know its depth and magnitude until the hour of separation. That's the whole exigence of that poem. He's heartbroken, right? Kim broke up with him, called the marriage off, and he's forlorn. So from there, we're going to flesh that out a little bit. And while in the throngs of experiencing the immediacy of this loss, everything hurts. No matter if one is just an average citizen or Hollywood's most recognizable star, the human experience of grieving wears the same face. So we're 3 sentences in. Hit me with the thesis because we're inverting. Kanye West expresses this idea in his poem through his litany of similes and the frequent use of anaphora. So my students don't do lit term dumps. I tell them to focus on the 2 or 3 most salient, most pertinent terms, and this student went with the similes and the anaphora. So they've had a little bit of AP language under their belt, so they will use some rhetorical terms in this poetry analysis as well. So you can see here it's 3 plus 1. 3, authorial intent, 1, construction of meaning. Note the vocab, great words, magnitude, throngs, immediacy, recognizable. So don't overdo it. Don't sound like a goon. Don't sound contrived. Don't sound pretentious. But look at the suppleness of the sentence. So you begin with this independent clause, and then look at this second sentence. Like, a lot of students don't do that right here where my arrow is pointing, right? So that's something that my students get in the Nuance Academy, knowing how to punctuate correctly and create a nice cadence in their flow, and it just flows. It's really nice. So out of the gate, this student is blazing, and I think any AP reader would read this and say, if this kid continues to pull this off, I'm going to give him the sophistication point. This is some stellar writing. So it all comes from Intensive Word Study Academy, Intensive Nuance Academy. Practice, practice, practice. Equip the kids with templates. Bob Ross, your instruction. Here's sample number 2. There are some things in life that are hard to reconcile, like the finality of divorce. Again, exigence, aha, the eureka moment. Like, why is Kanye writing this poem? 3 sentences. Don't plot summarize. But for some, acceptance can be rather elusive. In these cases, the one who is suffering and grieving can get so engrossed in their loss that they in effect spend their time beating their head against a wall, hoping to transform it into a door. This idea is clearly manifest in Kanye's poem through his hyperbolic diction and grocery list of hurts. So this one's done very well. One of the things that I teach my students to do is balance the academic, the tier 2, with the colloquial and the vernacular. I love that the student says things like grocery list, beating their head against a wall. When they do that and couple it with tier 2 like reconcile, right, engrossed, it bodes really well for them. I really think you need to teeter-totter the colloquial, the vernacular, and the academic to get the sophistication point, but also punctuation's key. You can't be making mistakes. So this follows the exact same template. 3 plus 1, 3 sentences, authorial intent, 1 sentence, construction of meaning. They chose different terms, but it's all good. Grocery list instead of saying litany. I like it. It's pretty cool, pretty hip. Number 3, done the exact same way. 3 plus 1. While divorce literally unbinds 2 people who vowed to stay together for life, it can shackle a person to grief and suffering. When one truly loves another person and that love comes to an end, it can be hard to accept and even harder to move on. Such losses can be so profoundly tragic that they can be difficult to give voice to. All right, so we're 3 sentences in, and note in all of these, don't plot summarize, don't quote, don't regurgitate the poem and like tell the story of the poem. You're focusing on universal theme, truth, authorial intent. Last sentence, hit me with the terms and devices. But in Kanye's poem, he touches upon these themes through his long list of similes and simple allusions. It's a very rich poem, so it does, it does matter what students say, what they attribute to being the most salient, the most pertinent terms. The allusions, the similes, the litany, based on our discussion of the poem, that's what we determine to be. The ones that are at the forefront, and there's a bunch of bit part terms and devices in there that will come in the body paragraphs in terms of analyzing the totality of the poem. So, all right, you've seen 3 for Kanye. Let's see 3 for the rose that grew from concrete. And again, this poem's in the packet should you request it, but this one's easy to find. Very famous poem. So, same thing, new poem, same template, 3+1. In a sense, America has its caste system. It stands to reason that if one grows up in poverty, they will be stuck in that predicament for life, and vice versa. This is especially true of kids growing up in the urban jungle. Tupac, however, proved to be an exception to this rule, which is depicted through the, drop the terms, personification and extended metaphor of the rose. So this is a very, very simple poem. It's not very complex, but it's good, juicy, pithy poem for students to have kind of an introduction to poetry. Like I said, I do this unit early in the academic year. Number 2 for Tupac is going to follow the 3+1 paradigm. 3 sentences, what is the authorial intent? 1 sentence, how does the author construct meaning? Rags to riches stories are at the fabric of the concept of the American dream. But the thing is, especially for minorities, actualizing these dreams is rare. It takes a lot of gut, perseverance, determination, and a bit of divine intervention to invert the typical course of how one's life script plays out. Now we're going to do the terms and devices. 4th sentence, construction of meaning. Tupac, through the personification of the rose, expresses how he is one such fortunate individual to have made something remarkable of his life from the seeming scraps of nothing. And again, all of these are following the same exact formula, the exact same template or heuristic. So note the complexity of the sentences. After this first, short sentence here, this independent clause, but the thing is, comma, especially for minorities, comma, actualizing these dreams is rare. It takes a lot of gut, comma, perseverance, comma, determination, and a bit of divine intervention to invert the typical course of how one's life script plays out. Tupac, comma, right? So great flow, great rhythm, great voice. The vocab is up, but in the kids' wheelhouse. They don't sound contrived. They don't sound like they're forcing the issue. And there's this little small, spillage of colloquial and vernacular in this that gives it a little bit of spunk and pizzazz, which I really like. So last one, 6 out of 6, all done the exact same way. By and large, one is born into their lot in life. For the vast majority of Americans, if one is born poor, they will remain in positions of poverty for life, no matter their efforts. And conversely, those born into privileged spaces tend to stay there regardless of how life unfolds. Tupac, however, is an anomaly in that he defies this narrative and metaphorically becomes a rose that grew from the most infertile of places. So again, drop the terms in that last sentence. So every single time a student writes literary analysis, so especially for AP Lit, all FRQs can be constructed using the inverted thesis template. Every single one. And there's plenty in my YouTube channel, and we go over this exhaustively in my National Writing Project course, the Teach It Right 5-week Mastermind. And you will become expert in this, and you will become expert in Bob Rossing your instruction. So not only will you be able to equip your students with these templates, but you will be able to manipulate them as well so that you can write your own models and exemplars with ease, and they'll just flow off your pen in time. It's very easy to do this. So the next question is this: how do I write the body paragraphs? I'm going to show you two. One done perfectly perfect using the Kanye poem, and then one that breaks the line of reasoning featuring the Tupac poem. And as I alluded to earlier, I'll show you my ball of yarn trick with the Tupac. So let's see how to perfectly execute it, and then we'll botch it all up with the Tupac poem. First, in case you're new to me and my template, I'll briefly go over the syllogistic method. If you want to do a deeper dive into this, there's plenty in my YouTube channel that unpacks this at greater depth. So the syllogistic method comes from the Aristotelian tradition. Aristotle ran a school called the Lyceum, and the rich aristocratic boys would go there to learn things like polemics, oration, debate, wordsmithing, word wrangling, and they would throw out these juicy essential questions, and they're featured in texts that you might be familiar with, like Plato's Republic, where the essential question is, what is justice? And all these great philosophical think takers come to the mic and they drop their definition of what justice is or what justice is not. Each definition is a syllogism, and a syllogism is this mathematical, computative, cogent line of reasoning that proceeds from premise, premise, conclusion. So if I were to say premise one, arsenic is deadly, we'd all say, yep, that's true. And then to follow it up with premise two, my dog ate arsenic, we'd all conclude, uh-oh, that dog might die. All right, that's not a good situation. So we want kids to be that bulletproof, that locked in their line of reasoning, and to adhere in a very, lockstep, cogent manner throughout their arguments. For the purposes of performing literary analysis, and this is true for all genres, and it's even true for rhetorical analysis, they would just use rhetorical terms and devices instead of literary. So the first premise is going to be an argument containing terms and or devices. Here's something that I think gets lost in the teaching of composition. All expository writing, so all the expository modes, are an act of argument. Literary analysis, rhetorical analysis, argument, persuasion, synthesis, research. You got to argue. And I'm going to make a video in the coming weeks where I look at College Board sample papers for Lang and Lit and demonstrate, illustrate that most of what kids do is plot summation. They rate plot analysis and not literary analysis or rhetorical analysis. They cease to argue once they get to their body paragraphs. So it's very imperative that for literary analysis, that students argue. The second premise is the textual support. And again, I like to see a teeter-totter balance of quoting and paraphrasing. And the conclusion of the syllogistic body paragraph, so not the conclusion of the essay, but the body paragraph, is the textual analysis. And it's links, promises, echo. So the student needs to echo the thesis, echo the prompt, and go shake hands with the promise of the first premise at the end. So syllogism comes full circle on itself. One question that students often ask is, where do I begin my analysis in the first body paragraph? And I always tell them, start where the author starts. So we're going to start right where Kanye starts, literally his first words of the poem. So we're going to indicate that with a transition like this, right from the onset. It cues the reader into knowing that you are chronologically, sequentially going to proceed through the poem, that you have a line of reasoning, that you're organized, right? Because you don't want to just haphazardly tackle the poem and have a hodgepodge of disorganized threads of connection. Go chronologically, go sequentially. So focus on the very first literary things that he does in the poem, right? And multitask here. Get a couple of things going so as not to have one body paragraph tone, one body paragraph diction, one body paragraph syntax, one body paragraph allusion, right? You got to multitask and see how the terms and devices hold hands with each other. So look how I do this here. Right from the onset, Kanye anchors his sorrow in simple and relatable comparisons. So we're going to focus on the juxtapositions, the similes, the metaphors. First, using the blunt force of short, simple declarative sentences. So we're going to focus on the syntax second. He offers an exhaustive litany of similes to express what his divorce from Kim Kardashian feels like. As if to convey that words are inadequate, his seemingly endless enumeration of grief goes on at great lengths. One thing I do during my writing workshops with students when we're looking at their work is we put the language of the first premise into the language of a promise. And this student is saying, I promise you, dear reader, that we're going to take a look at the comparisons, whatever they are, juxtapositions, dichotomies, binaries, whatever you want to call it. We're going to take a look at the syntax. We're going to take a look at those litanies. And then probably touch upon tone quite a bit too. So here's the thing. We have to go in order. You said this first, second, third, fourth. So you have to go first, second, third, fourth, right? Go in order, go in sequence. That's what a line of reasoning is. So since you're talking about the comparisons up here first, beginning in the fourth sentence, which initiates the second premise, you got to talk about comparisons. From there, go to syntax. So look how this follows here. Immediately, so that his audience can relate at the gut level, he suggests that divorce feels like full-blown COVID. All right, perfect. So we have a comparison, and the quote uses the word like, so it's a simile, right? We're talking about comparisons. So this template really helps students quote with deliberation. Sometimes I find students quote because they have to quote, and it's rather haphazard. That my template really ensures that students are quoting with deliberation if they're staying focused. So we quoted, we got to analyze. Writing this poem and experienced this divorce in the midst of a global pandemic, Wes correlates his feelings to perhaps the biggest shared fear, catching COVID. As is clear, COVID can stop an entire world dead in its tracks. It is ruthless and shows no mercy. This opening line is at the crux of establishing his ethos and pathos in terms of the universality of experiencing and processing loss. But as to come off as not being a sad, hyperbolic emo sap, he backs off so as not to come off as being overly dramatic by informing us that divorce feels like your doctor don't know shit. There is helplessness and a certain degree of frustration when that happens. Doctors quite clearly serve a purpose, but very often they prove their fallibility and limitations as well, which leaves the patient in a lurch. Syntactically, do you see how that comes? Because look, we had it back here. That was the second thing that was promised. So you just go in order. So you front load what you're going to talk about to establish the line of reasoning in the first premise, but it allows students to connect the pieces of the poem together. Syntactically, it is important to notice that Kanye does not conclude his statements properly with a period. In doing this, it is clear that his suffering is likewise without end. I like this. So, does not conclude with a period. Why is that important? Analyze it. Because his grief is without end. Periods are end statements. The first word of every line places emphasis on the subject of his anguish, divorce. Bold and capitalized, we are repeatedly reminded that his separation from Kim is the cause of his spiritual beating every evening. Rhetorically, the litany makes sure to not trespass into pathetic terrain, so Kanye drops something heavy and then backtracks and lightens the mood. For example, perhaps alluding to Jesus, we are told that divorce feels like nails in your hand. On one hand, he juxtaposes his divorce to crucifixion, but in the next breath, he suggests that divorce feels like Michael Myers. All right, so let's talk about this here. There's a good teeter-totter balance of quoting, paraphrasing, analysis, support. In order to get kids to quote with smooth, silky transitions to embed, I have them use a template called the 5-word rule. If a student places a minimum of 5 words in front of the quote and keeps the quote relatively small, it'll read like all these quotes in here, silky smooth, like you could close your eyes and not even hear the transition. So we quoted. Let's move on. Analyze. This illusion pumps the brakes on is not overdoing the emotional vomiting. And again, even in the body paragraphs, colloquial, academic vernacular, emotional vomiting. I like this back here, hyperbolic emo sap, right? This is what kids need to do to get the sophistication point. Keep the vocab up, but show their spunk, their pizzazz, their flair. So we are at the conclusion of the body paragraph. Look at how it all links and echoes back. It is important to keep in mind that although Kanye is going very public with his grief, he has a reputation and an image to uphold. In keeping up the facade and manipulation of Kim, he treads a very delicate line so as not to diminish himself while playing his sympathy card. So students often ask me this question: Mr. Kuhn, introductions are 4 sentences long. How many sentences should a body paragraph be? And I tell them shoot for 10 to 12. You can see this one runs over by 3 sentences. And I think if we were to revise this, a lot of this COVID stuff is tangential. I would cut it. So just this first mention to COVID here is enough. These 2 sentences really don't need to be there. They don't add anything to the analysis. It just sort of contextualizes the setting, which really is not needed above and beyond the first sentence. So to trim the fat, I'd get rid of those 2 sentences and move on. So I usually have a hard cap of 12 sentences, 10 to 12 for a body paragraph. Those little itty bitty 4 or 5 sentence baggers that we often get and see on the AP exam, there's just not enough support or analysis to go anywhere with that. Very cool. So how do I tackle the body paragraphs for the Tupac poem? Same thing, you're going to proceed syllogistically. 3 sentences to set up the argument in the first premise, teeter-totter balance the quoting and the paraphrasing, and keep it 10 to 12 sentences. Quote with deliberation. So here's the syllogistic method again. So we're going to have an argument containing terms and devices. We're going to start where Tupac starts. Teeter-totter balance the quoting and paraphrasing. Echo, promise, links. Echo, promise, links. So let's talk about the yarn test that I've alluded to. This is a guaranteed way to ensure that the line of reasoning stays intact. So I have yarn in my room, and students print their papers out for me, and we put them on the board, or I put them into Canvas slides like the ones you see here, and we project them on the overhead. And what we do is this. So we'll take a student's first premise, and this is one for the Tupac poem, and we'll place different color strings of yarn next to each promise of the first premise. And then we'll see if the chronology and the sequence is adhered to have a nice supple line of reasoning like we had in the Kanye poem. So you can see here, this student is going to start where Tupac starts, right? Show the chronology, show the sequence. And they're using the exact same words as the Kanye poem. Right from the onset, Tupac's rhetorical question brings to light the odd paradox of his rags to riches story. So the first yarn is blue, and we're going to focus on the paradox. So in the 4th sentence, we should be talking about the paradox. We're going to quote the paradox or paraphrase it. Our red yarn is going to attach to, let's see, he draws attention to the fact that he is an anomaly. Kids growing up in such settings typically do not actualize the degree of success that he has been so blessed to witness in his lifetime. So probably red would be like characterization. All right, so that would come after the paradox. We'd have to quote something about his characterization or that backstory. And then yellow is going to be attached to this. The extended metaphor of the rose is yellow, illustrates Tupac's sheer grit to make something wonderful of his life despite the insurmountable odds, despite all of the insurmountable odds. So, all right, we got this all set up. So in the 4th sentence, we should be able to connect blue to blue in the 4th sentence. But look where this student goes. All right, we're right here. Look at my arrow. So fourth sentence begins second promise. We should be talking about paradox, blue to blue, but look what happens. As one of the most prominent rappers of all time, Tupac chose to explain to the world that he learned to breathe fresh air. He overcame his impoverished upbringing. He succeeded. By writing this poem, he proves that even though no one ever cared, he surpassed the stereotype of the streets and triumphed to fame. This is all fine, but we just broke our line of reasoning. We promised the reader to be talking about paradox, and we kind of just slipped into a summation with embedded quotes, right? We're no longer doing literary analysis. We're not analyzing terms and devices. We just sort of summarized a whole bunch of stuff. So let's go back. Red is going to get into characterization. So we kind of skipped the blue and in a way roundabout sort of kind of went to red. Let's see if we get to the yellow, the extended metaphor. So it goes on to the next slide. Tupac brought inspiration to the children in the ghetto, demonstrating to them that everyone has the ability to move up the social web. Such a rags to riches story just doesn't happen on its own. Tupac tells us that by keeping its dreams, it learned to breathe fresh air. Most kids that grow up in the urban jungle get beaten down by their environment, but Tupac learned to walk without having feet, and that he did not let his bleak surroundings dictate the course of his life. Goodness gracious, we didn't keep any promises whatsoever, right? We did not have any textual support for the blue, the red, or the yellow. We ran away from that promise like out of a house on fire. We bolted. So this is a good exercise where I literally taped to the board the blue and should connect the blue to the fourth sentence. The red should be connected to like, I don't know, seventh, eighth, ninth sentence, and the yellow should be coming down right before the conclusion. Go in order. So typically kids are going to link together 2 or 3 things depending on how juicy and pithy they are and how much support they need. So this student went with 3 things in the first premise, and none of them are aligned. The line of reasoning does not stay intact at all. So it's broken. So the next question is this: what do I do next? Bust out another syllogism. Just change the focus of the literary terms, kind of make a list of what needs to be analyzed, and proceed through the rest of the poem. You have a chronology, you have a sequence, go through what's left. All right. My students on the AP exam, all of their essays for Lang and Lit are 4 paragraphs long: intro, 2 bodies, conclusion. So in the second body paragraph, do what is left and get all of that into the first premise. All right, so that was a long writing workshop, and hopefully it helps you out quite a bit and your students in terms of sustaining their line of reasoning. That yarn exercise works like a charm. It really nicely illustrates and exemplifies how to sustain cogency from start to finish in a syllogistic body paragraph. So, as I've said a couple of times throughout this presentation, I'm honored to be working with the National Writing Project. They have picked up my Teach It Right 5-week mastermind, and it is being run through them, which is good news. A lot of teachers need professional development hours, and this has a badge of 10 hours. Even though it's a 5-week course, we meet 1 hour a week, and we always meet at Sunday night, 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, and go until 8. And we meet for 5 consecutive weeks. We begin the course with my Word Study Academy, my Nuance Academy. We focus on how the templates can be manipulated in all of the expository modes. We get into my alternative grading methods, my Plato discussion, the whole kit and caboodle of what I'm about. So it's a fantastic course, and National Writing Project is able to offer it relatively on the cheap in comparison to most PDs. So you can check that course out at www.teachinghowtowrite.com, or you can go directly to NWP, which is www.nwp.org. www.teachinghowtowrite.com is my page, my personal webpage, and there's plenty of information on there. If you want these slides, you can reach out to me at teachingwritingcoach@gmail.com, and I will send you the poems that the students will be using for their own analysis. As I said earlier, they can't use Kanye, they can't use Tupac because I already did, and I don't want them stealing my thunder. So teachingwritingcoach@gmail.com. So hopefully this helps you out quite a bit. For now, happy teaching and happy writing.